Today, we are going to talk about optimizing your go-to-market strategies. We're going to cover B2B as well as B2C, so you can really tailor and optimize your success. I'm super excited for you all to meet Arianna. She is a proud Pragmatic alum, and she's got over a decade of experience in product marketing and product strategy. She has focused on B2B as well as B2C, enterprise, healthcare sectors. She's led teams from really early stage as well as late stage startups, and she has built and scaled the product marketing function as well. So there's a ton for you to learn from her. And she specializes in product launches, global expansion, and market repositioning. So Arianna, I am so happy to have you with us today. I will pass it to you to say hello. And also, if you could share a little bit more about the work that you're doing now and your focus, I would love to hear it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I, like you said, have been in the product marketing space for quite a while now. I currently lead product marketing at a company called Virta Health, which is like a late stage startup. We have a small and mighty team and focused on all things across the product marketing, full stack funnel. We are a B2B to C company, and Verto Health is really focused on helping individuals improve and improve their metabolic health. So reversing diseases like type 2 diabetes and helping individuals who might be struggling with obesity or other related diseases. And we do that through a number of different tools and resources and care that we provide, really with the nutrition first philosophy as well. So happy to share more there. But on the product marketing side, we will get into this, but we own and focus on all things, particularly on the B2B side, and then enabling a lot of other teams to be successful on the B2C side. So we work with organizations and sell into employers, health plans, and lots of other health oriented organizations to provide access to individuals like you and me, so we can get access to the healthcare Virta is providing.
Fantastic. And it's got to be a really interesting kind of intersection of your work to kind of look at those different focuses, the B2B as well as the B2C, and making sure that your strategies are well mended for both.
Absolutely. And it's a fun challenge. It means when we're thinking about go-to-market, whether that's a new product launch, entering into a new market, lots of different types of go-to-market that we'll get into. But when we're thinking about that, there's almost two layers, at least for us to consider. And when we think about the value prop and the strategies, you have to make sure that you're being targeted in both, but that there's also some synergy across them, because buyers care what their members and people like you and me that may be working for those organizations, they care what we think, and so it's a very interesting cross section there.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't wait to learn more about it from you right now. So let's start at the very top and kind of work our way through. How do you define go-to-market most broadly?
Yeah, so go-to-market, I mean, there's a lot that can be encompassed within that. A lot of people think of it as a product launch, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a net new product launch. It could be we're launching a product into a new industry, a new market segment. And so there's lots of different ways to think about go-to-market. But regardless of what iteration you're focused on, I think there's a kind of a few key components to really consider. And it's sort of back to the basics. It's what's the who, what, when, where, and how of that launch. So you want to really understand the who and what they're all about. That's our personas, that, if you're B2B, that ideal customer profile, really getting into what those individuals care about, who are they, where do you find them, and all of those details. Then there's the strategy portion. Once you have an idea of what the market looks like, who those people are, how do you define the kind of messages and positioning that's going to really resonate? And of course, then thinking about the journey of those folks as you're learning about them. So in a B2B setting, that might be the buyer journey. And how can you map towards that? And then finally, there's lots of different components in the pricing, the packaging, all the pieces that connect into that positioning, and then the execution plan. So there's the research component, the strategy component, and then that execution component where you think about the channels, maybe enablement if you're in the B2B space. How do you prep for that internally? And then follow through with the launch.
Mm-hmm. I love all those different components, everything from the personas to the positioning, to the journey, to the execution, to the research. It sounds like really multifaceted work, even before you introduce the kind of different focus of B2B as well as B2C. Do all of those different activities you mentioned in a well executed go-to-market, are all of those present in both the B2B and the B2C go-to-market plans, or are there ever variances, do you find?
I think there's actually quite a lot of similarities between B2B and B2C. Some folks tend to think of them as, very different motions, but I tend to think that they, at the end of the day, we're all humans. And when we think about a go-to-market motion, we still need to answer those same core questions and probably do, we need to do the research and all of those steps for a top tier launch. But where you do the research, how you do that research might look different. The buyer journey will probably look very different. Maybe the pricing, packaging, the channels that you're looking at to access these different individuals will be different. And you might have very different personas as well, not just in what, those folks look like, but you might have a lot more people you need to appeal to in a B2B sales process, a number of different layers of approval, for example, versus a B2C sale might be a little bit more straightforward and direct in who you're selling to.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Let's chat a little bit about the research. You mentioned that. I want to dive into that. So when you are starting your research, where do you start? What kind of information are you looking for? Where do you find it? What are kind of the tactical practices that you dive into when you are kind of bringing, let's imagine, a brand new product or service to market? Where do you start? What are you looking for?
Yeah. Well, I will start by saying that research is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm a huge proponent for doing the research and really investing there before you jump into setting goals, the strategy, and the execution portion. And part of that's because I started my career in UX research and design. But when I think about research and where to start with a go-to-market strategy and plan, there's a few things that you want to think about, and it comes back to the who, what, when, where, how, and what you're trying to figure out when you start with. Depending on where you jump into the process as a product marketer, there may already be some data or resources that others internally have surfaced, your product team, other internal teams, as to who these folks might be that are interested, or why you're even considering entering this, industry or launching a new product in the first place. But either way, you really need to understand who are these people, and make sure we can think about how to segment down. So you don't want to target everyone to start. You really want to figure out who is going to get the most value out of what you're launching, as maybe an early adopter.
Hmm.
And so you want to think about different channels that you can access folks. That could be existing customers or existing data, where you can kind of mine that and look and see whether that's, app reviews, customer feedback. And I'm always a huge advocate for actually going and talking to folks. So whether that's a customer interview, prospective interview, if maybe you're in the B2C space, that's something that I like to do. Win-loss is another great source of data. And then there's lots of additional things that you can do, surveys, consumer surveys, B2B side of the house, to really understand who are these folks. And of course, different tactics. You're going to get different types of data. So you might want to start broad, and then when you have an idea of who those folks might be, maybe you're employing some of those interview tactics or other ways to get some of that qualitative data as well.
I I'm going to take a tiny deep dive because I love asking people this question. Because you are such a proponent of customer interviews and you love talking to the market, do you have a like slam dunk back pocket question that you ask in every interview, or that you like love the opportunity to ask?
Oh gosh, everyone already always asks this, and I feel like everyone has different questions. One the classic question that I sometimes ask is, if you had a magic wand, um, if you're presenting a new product, like if you had a magic wand, like what's one thing that you would do to change this? Or, what would you do? And that kind of invites them to think a little bit bigger about what you're putting in front of them, and pushes them a little bit, even if they say, "Hey, I love what you're showing me," um, invites them to get kind of more creative and give you a little bit more insight into where they're coming from. And I find it just opens up the conversation.
Yeah. I also it's a really slick strategy. It's pretty elegant because you're encouraging them to give a little bit of feedback without any kind of negative connotation. There's a creative connotation and like a collaborative building together. So very, very slick. I like that one a lot. I'm sure folks are going to put that in their back pockets. So how are you using some of your competitive analysis to shape your research and then kind of add it and layer it into your strategy? Does that happen at the same time as you're doing research into the market, or how does that inform what you're doing with research?
Yeah, so competitive in the markets that I've worked in has been very important.
Okay.
They've been pretty highly competitive markets. Right now, focusing in metabolic health. We've all seen a million ads about that recently. And then in the past, prior to that, was working in the mental health space, which has also been a big focus in the media. And so competitive has been really critical to our strategy and my team's approach. And that starts even at the point of deciding, should we enter a market? Should we launch a product? We need to be aware of who the players are, what their positioning is, and how we're uniquely able to kind of fill a gap or add value in comparison to what's already there, and how established those organizations might be in those markets. So, sometimes that's very industry dependent or specific. Sometimes there's, different competitors that are just broadly, across different categories. But I'd say it kind of comes into competitive comes into the strategy at a few key points. One is the decision, should we move forward? Two is the decision around, understanding how existing folks who might find value from their product, how are they perceiving those competitors? How are they consuming them? And then, of course, when you're thinking about messaging, positioning, and then the channel strategy as well, pricing, packaging. Competitive for me oftentimes comes into play with all of those. And at the very least, you should make an informed decision if it should impact things like pricing or not. So you can be proactive in that understanding and
Yeah.
setting expectations internally.
Yeah. So I know that you mentioned that for your market research, you really like direct access to folks, and customer interviews, and also win-loss is a really great place that you go for market research. Do you have a couple examples of where you go for your competitive research? Are you looking at kind of like research houses and firms? Are you doing DIY on Google? Where are your like go-to watering holes for competitive research? What tools do you use?
Sure. So this for me has varied again based on what stage company I'm working at. So, there's always different resources and tools available. So this has varied for me widely. When I was the first product marketer at a company, we're very early stage, very scrappy. Everything from doing deep dive Google searches, Google alerts. Those are always helpful. Um, Sometimes friends and family members might have feedback. So you want to be, thoughtful about how you're collecting that feedback. But finding different ways to kind of get access to that information. And then again, app reviews, huge in terms of understanding what existing users of competitors like and dislike, because you're going to get, the worst and the best there. And then I'd say the third thing is, talking to, if you're in the B2B space, talking to prospects, talking to others in the space. You oftentimes get some friendlies who are willing to just share, what their perspective is, even if it is just in the context of, hey, I'm trying to better understand the market. And they're not going to give you the pricing and packaging, but they'll give you some other useful data points.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I had not thought about reading the reviews on other people's apps. I think that's a pretty slick one, or other people's websites, or even kind of like a G2 kind of space. I think that's a really good idea. So the product management team also tends to be heavily involved with market research and competitive analysis. Can you talk a little bit about your typical relationship with the product management team as you're prepping a market approach, and kind of specifically, how do you and your team understand the product itself and the problem it solves, and how does the product management team kind of wrap into your go-to-market strategy?
Yeah. There can be a lot of overlap, certainly, between product management and product marketing. And in some ways, I think that's a good thing. As long as you're aligned, you should both be thinking about all of those components. And the way that I've done this, again, it varies based on the company and how things are set up. But for me, product marketing is always involved in the go-to-market and product launch process before you even make a decision to say yes or no, we're going to move forward with something. We're involved up front, and even probably surfacing the need for a new product or service based on the ongoing research that we're doing.
Okay.
So that may be different from other organizations, but typically, I mean, that's the ideal state, right? Is you have this ongoing process where you're collecting data, research, and insights that may surface the need or opportunity in a certain sector. And then once we make that decision to move forward, typically what I've done is product marketing takes the lead, especially on a lot of the B2B side of the house in terms of that. And then maybe some of the other teams will dig more into the consumer side, but we're both in all of those conversations, and more just kind of a divide and conquer type of approach. But then we're able to use those pieces of data and information for different types of things. So the product team might make a decision on features that we need for launch. Maybe like in one example, I've launched products where we thought we needed a whole set of features for our MVP to be successful in the market and be competitive. We went and did a little extra research and found actually we didn't need certain features that were going to be harder to operationally execute on. And so we were able to actually de-scope some of that MVP launch based on that and other factors as well. So that's a few touch points and milestones that we typically work together on, but it is very collaborative, I would say.
Yeah. Sounds like a really nice kind of symbiotic and as you say, collaborative relationship. I think it's one of the areas that feels daunting to a lot of product marketers, and not necessarily with the product management team, but with the organization as a whole, right? Because you've got marcoms, you've got sales, you've got product, in a lot of cases, you've got development teams, and trying to get everybody on the same page and working to get everyone aligned and in unison. Do you have any kind of tips or tricks for that, or experiences that what's worked really well for you if you are developing this really comprehensive strategy from the start? How do you make sure that all those different departments are aligned and on the same page to execute seamlessly?
Yeah, so I've built launch functions at various companies. Again, startups, you typically join and they don't, in my experience, there's not always a very super structured, clear process on how do we evaluate opportunities in the market for growth, and how do we then take action on that as an organization. A lot of it happens, that's how the company's been successful, but it can be a little more ad hoc. And so one of the things that I've done in my last role was help to just bring a little bit of structure. And the way that I did that and approached that was after a launch we did that was successful, but definitely had some bumps. Did a retrospective across the company with the key organizations internally to learn what we could do differently and better next time, and what was working and what do we want to kind of keep doing. And then use those learnings and that as a launch pad to recommend kind of a more connected process that we could all use going forward, but use that as a launching point to have some cohesion internally, but to do that and get everyone's buy-in on that, which can be hard to do. I mean, I won't lie, it was a long process. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in a month. But it did ensure that everyone was in agreement that we could be a little more coordinated. And so it was really how we go about doing that, which product marketing and product management kind of co-led together. But that's certainly something that then we iterated on year to year as we move forward. But that's kind of how we got started.
Yeah. There's a question that just came in that I want to ask you from the audience here that I think what you've just shared about the retrospective experience kind of answers the question, but I want to offer it to you as well to see if there's areas you want to expand. So they are wondering, based on your experience with product launches, where there sounds like there's a lot of overlap between product management and product marketing, what kind of specific strategies do you use to set clear roles and responsibilities between the two teams so that you're working really nicely together, but you're not stepping on each other's toes or like elbowing each other out of the way?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a few approaches here. One, like I have sat down, especially when there's like new leadership coming in on either side, just sat down and said, let's map this out. Like, where do we have overlap? And where is product marketing really taking the lead? Or product management really the clear and, taking the lead owner. And then for those areas where we agree, yeah, there is overlap and there should be overlap. And then just thinking through and talking through, well, how do we work together on those? And, you don't have to wait for a new leader to come in to do that. And that gives folks a starting point. But I also think, every relationship between a product marketer and a product manager is a little bit different. Folks enjoy doing different things. You might have different interests. And so I do think it doesn't always have to be, here's the roles and responsibilities cut and dry. I think you also want to take into context who you're working with on that one-to-one basis, and also what else is going on within the organization at that point in time. A lot of us are working on multiple launches, or in my case, I'm not just focused on product launches. We're a full stack product marketing team. So part of it is recognizing where there is that overlap and just having an open conversation. And then part of it is taking into account the rest of the context of the business.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot more questions coming in. Keep those questions coming, folks, but I'm going to save them for a little bit later because I want to ask Arianna about marketing strategy. I want to kind of start digging into the meat here. So you mentioned early at the top of our conversation that positioning was really something that you focused on. Can you talk a little bit about your positioning process and your strategy and how you're really making sure that your positioning is resonating with the market? I think a lot of product marketers I talk to love making their positioning, but they feel like, I hope it fits. I think it fits, right? So how are you really making sure that it is aligned with the market? Do you have any tips?
Yes. This is always the age-old question. You want to make sure, does it resonate? Is it working? Well, in terms of process, so that first part of the question, there's lots of different frameworks out there to reference. I think they're all great, and there's not like one that I've used consistently every time. I think a lot of product marketers have probably read or at least heard about, obviously, Awesome and April Dunford. She has a framework that's very simple and straightforward, which I appreciate that. And when I talk to internal stakeholders, that resonates. They want something that just feels simple. A complicated framework does not resonate typically with others internally. So with that, there's kind of a process that you can go through, but you really want to understand and get at what's the competitive landscape, what's the unique value that you are delivering, who cares about that value, and then how can you create a context where that is that specific value, it shines.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's kind of a bunch of research that goes into that. But then in terms of does it resonate, then it comes back to testing it in different ways. And I don't know if there's a silver bullet for this, but some things that I've been doing recently, one, testing with and kind of doing live pitch testing in the B2B context. So that could be with existing customers. There's also different influencers or organizations where we have a strong relationship and can kind of go to them as, advisors and get their, thought leadership perspective. But really we're testing out to see what the feedback is.
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to test very specific messages, then there's lots of other tactics that you can use. But when you're thinking about the overall positioning and how that translates into some basic messaging, I think just getting that early live feedback in whatever way you can is great. That could even be from internal teams. Like if you're just working on this, hopefully you're working cross-functionally on this, but it could even be testing something out with a customer success team member, sales team member, or even someone else maybe someone on your team that's like interfacing with customers day to day if you're in a B2C world.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of different angles, but if you're trying to be scrappy, you can talk to folks internally.
And just make sure you're not like clickety clacking alone in a room, just making things up, right? Um, I was having a conversation with someone the other day and we were talking about KFIs, so key failure indicators, which is not like a term, just an interesting flip of a KPI. And so thinking about the concept of what are some of the early flags and warning signs that something is not working? Do you have any KFIs that the positioning is like, what would be happening that would make you think, huh, maybe I have a positioning problem, or like maybe that's not quite aligned the way that we thought it was? Is there anything like that that you look for as an early warning sign?
Yes. I think, one thing to consider is for the folks that you work with internally, who are either talking to your buyers every day or your customers, are you getting pushback, and what is that pushback? I think you shouldn't always take that as a warning sign because change is hard. So you will get feedback across the board, both the good and the bad throughout the process. But that's one thing to just be mindful of and pay attention to, and really listen to. Like, don't just address it and try to accept all feedback, but really understand where that's coming from. And then I think from there, once you really internally feel like you have something that's worth putting out, there's lots of different tactics that we use to get the message out. So for each of those, whether it's, PR, talking to analysts, these different channels, there's different ways that we look at that. I'd say for me, feedback from influencers is really important. In the B2B healthcare space, there's a lot of consultants that play a significant role, similar to an analyst or someone else in other industries. And so understanding their feedback is really important. And then there's also just the quantitative feedback around, if you put something out there, and whether it's a launch email or PR, is it resonating with the groups of people you think it should be? Is it resonating with other groups? So really just making sure that, you're kind of checking those assumptions, and you're never going to be perfect. It's never going to be 100%. But you want to look for those early indicators, like you said, but the leading, and make sure there's leading indicators for all of your lagging indicators as well that will come with time.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And the idea of, I think often we put together an entire package and kind of polish it and ship it off and be like, it's great, I know that it's working. But I love what you've said about like just dipping a little bit into the market and getting a little feedback, and then a little more and getting a little feedback and kind of tweaking as you go, I think is fantastic. Okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit because I really want to ask you about segmentation, because I feel like this is one of the areas that you're going to see the biggest difference between B2B and B2C, right? So thinking about kind of how does your segmentation process differ? Is the process very different, or is it more just kind of the focus is different, right? So if I was segmenting for B2C, I'm sure age would be a much bigger difference than in B2B, right? Can you talk just generally about your segmentation and some of the trends that you see in how you segment groups in B2B compared to B2C?
Sure. So maybe I'll start on the B2B side, and then we can talk B2C. I'd say overall, yeah, the access to data can really differ depending on the products that you're working on. And you may be in the B2B space and have tons of data, and customers, and you may be in the B2B space and have 100 customers, and have a very specific product that you're offering to a very specific audience. So I think that's the first thing I call out, is just like the type of data and the amount of data can, in some cases, differ depending on the product. Process-wise, on the B2B side, again, when I'm starting out, I'm trying to understand like what's that ideal customer profile. And so there's different factors that I'm thinking about there. It's likely customer size, segment, industry, maybe when it comes to the persona as well, like where do those personas live? Maybe not every, enterprise B2B company has a certain, I guess, persona. For example, in my last organization focused on mental health, we'd oftentimes target a well-being specialist on an HR team, someone whose job it is to make sure that, individuals at those companies and their families have a great experience, have great access to mental health care. But certainly not every company has one of those. So that was something that we would look at as well. And then the profile of that individual. Are they new at an organization? Have they been at the organization for 15 years? Maybe that's an indicator that they're not really looking for new and innovative solutions. So lots of things to think about on the B2B side. And then we were able to kind of segment and test out some of that in the research. On the B2C side, again, a lot of different factors that we are looking at, and would typically we'll segment this out and test pretty quickly and iteratively with email and different platforms to see if we're kind of on the right track. But like you said, age is a big factor for us at my existing company. And then there's, are they experiencing the challenges that we can help address? So that's, one thing in healthcare. We always have to be really, really mindful of what data we're using, what we're looking at. And there's a lot of sensitivity there, so that can be a little more challenging, I will say. But a lot of different factors to look at, and then where those individuals spend their time are going to be different places as well. So looking to understand that, and we can usually get to a much more granular level on the B2B side with who we're looking for, who we're targeting to start, and then kind of broaden over time as we learn.
Yeah. The other area that I imagine can be pretty different is an actual launch, right? And I know we've talked about how GotoMarket does not necessarily involve a net new product launch, but if and when it does, let's talk about that. What are the differences between launching something B2B versus launching B2C? Is it like, does it sit in the same position within your larger strategy? Is it bigger, smaller, earlier, later? What are kind of some of the best practices for a successful launch announcement and initiative in each of those different scenarios?
Sure. Well, I can speak from my experience and what I have done on the B2B side. Where I've worked, it's typically been much longer sales cycles.
Okay.
And that actually plays a huge role in launch planning and when we announce versus when the product's actually live in the product, and then how we promote and sell that over time. So timelines can be very different. Typically, we would announce for our B2B buyers very early on based on their sales cycle or their buying journey. And then we would build that as we're going. So yeah, that's kind of the high level process, just based on having a very long sales cycle.
Yeah.
So once they are ready to launch, the product's already live.
Okay.
On the B2B side, we folks, when they're ready to go, they are ready to use the product day one. So we typically might do some promo before the launch. It's live in the product to drum up interest. We want to create that awareness, thinking about that full marketing funnel. But it's going to be much closer to that launch. It's instead of, months and months ahead, it's going to be maybe a month or two, but probably closer to a month. And then really focusing on when the product is live, driving engagement towards that in the B2B side. And that works out well for us because we can kind of focus on the B2C side or B2B side, get that going, and then shift gears to the B2C side.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. I feel like kind of pros and cons and risks and benefits on both sides though, right?
Yes, 100%. I mean, on the B2B side, there's always a little bit of nervousness. We're usually we've started to work on it, of course, when we announce, but it's not finished. It's not completed. And that, of course, internal teams, it's something that as product marketers, we have to help manage. And make sure the sales team's good to go and they have what they need and they're confident in what they're selling, and that there's enough alignment internally on what you're building, so that there's enough clarity there, and making sure the internal teams as well are comfortable with what you're sharing out. So product marketing does have to play a little bit of that role and that connective glue as well.
Yeah. I really want to dig in and ask more questions about this, but I am looking at the time and there's a question about measurement and KPIs I want to ask you. So
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to tell folks in the chat, does anybody else launch their B2B products like this? Do you sign a deal with a set of early customers as the product is in production and as you're about to launch it? If that is true, if that is you, tell me in the chat if that is how it works out and what are your lessons? What are your biggest aha moments to make that process go really smoothly? And what are some of the watch outs and kind of the risks that you plan for ahead of time? Because it's a really shrewd strategy, but obviously you have to be heads up about it. So if anyone is doing that, tell me in the chat. I'd be really interested to hear about it. But I want to make sure that we have a couple minutes before we start taking questions to talk about goals and measurement, right? And the first question I want to ask you is, if you can talk about where in your process you are setting and defining your goals and KPIs, right? I know that you mentioned you want research to come before that, but I do feel like we all have this tendency of metrics and KPIs like going at the very end. Like we just kind of slap them on. We're like, oh shoot, we have to measure this thing. And even I'm guilty of it because this is one of the last questions that I am asking you instead of asking at the beginning of the process, right? So where do you start thinking about goals, KPIs, and measurement in your overall GTM strategy?
Yes. We've probably all been there where we set goals a little later than we would have wanted to in retrospect. But what I try to do and encourage my team to do is set goals, and they don't even have to be specific at this point, but have alignment on the goals and why you're launching, whether it's a new product, entering a new market. Like, why are we doing that as an organization? Are we trying to expand our total addressable market? Is this a retention play? Is there, something is it help to scale the business? Like, let's just be clear on the high level reason as an organization that we're launching, because that's going to really inform, again, a lot of the positioning, packaging, pricing, all of those things potentially, and will save you a lot of time later. If you're like, no, actually, this is just for customer retention, then that's very helpful to know. And sometimes there's folks aren't really totally aligned on that internally.
Okay.
So I'd say that's the first thing I try to align on from a goal perspective is what's the intention? And then certainly goal setting is important. It can be challenging if you don't have a lot of data or historic data to help benchmark. But again, thinking about like the leading and lagging indicators, um, I will usually try to set goals around like how many accounts or, how many sales, whether it's an account or size of account, just total people who have access to the product, and try to do that again, certainly before you're like rolling out to your internal teams. And again, ideally before you're making positioning decisions, but realistically speaking, it will probably come a little after that. And then, of course, when you're thinking about like much more tactical decisions and metrics
Yeah.
for, hey, our launch emails or those sorts of like leading indicators, hopefully you have lots of historic data to reference on that can be a good benchmark. And so I think that, you can do some of that a little bit closer to the launch. But as long as you're kind of aligned on like what those top line goals are and what everyone's going to be held accountable to, then you can figure out how you need to measure to make sure you're working towards that.
Yes. Yes. Good. I think really good feedback and an area that I think that a lot of folks miss. I agree with you. I think that we often jump right to, okay, we want this percentage of usage or, we jump right into the actual number, but no one steps back and has the conversation and says, okay, are we trying to build market share or are we just trying to retain customers? Like, let's start very much at the top of these things. So a good advice and a good reminder for all of us in starting there. Okay, we got a bunch of questions in here. And dear participants, we have a bunch of questions in the chat. Please do me the favor, if you have a question in the chat, pop it into the Q&A. I will go and take a look at the chat and grab your questions in there, but it can be difficult for those to surface to me to ask Arianna. So if you really want them answered, put them in the Q&A for me. While you are doing that, I will tell everybody that on September 18th, we're really excited. We are hosting the Pragmatic Institute Summit. And so it's focused on the future of product management. We are going to have alum and subject matter experts that are amazing, just like Arianna. So I hope that you will join us. It's free for you to join. It's our first annual event. So I hope that you will come join us. Callie's going to pop a link down there for you. Okay, there are some really good questions in here that are going to take us kind of back to the beginning of the conversation, Arianna, but I really like this one. Angela, great question. When you are interviewing a customer to get competitive data, what types of questions are you asking, right? So you talked earlier about when you're chatting with a prospect or maybe a customer, right? They're not going to tell you like what's the pricing and the packaging of the competitor, but how do you kind of navigate that sensitive topic? You don't want to be uncouth and like blow the opportunity, especially if there's still a prospect. What kinds of things are you asking them?
Sure. I think if you're thinking about competitive specifically, there's a few things that you can think about. The first is one, just taking the time up front, of course, to get to know them and, kind of on a more personal level, making sure they feel comfortable in the conversation. And then, thinking about it less around competition and more around how do you solve these challenges today? What have you tried? Have you heard about others that have tried other approaches? Whether that is, a colleague of theirs, if they're in the B2B space, or even a friend or a family member, to try to kind of open up the conversation around other possible approaches and solutions. Another approach that's much more specific, but if you're really trying to get customer competitive specific data on, maybe you have two main competitors.
Mhm.
One thing, if you have a specific question you're trying to answer, is I've done kind of blinded show and tell almost. So taking logos out of everything, taking, hopefully like blinding it in a way where they can't tell exactly the customer or the competitor that you're talking about, but actually just putting, whether it's pricing or positioning, or even like website features, different things up, and just putting them side by side and saying like, tell me, we're trying to understand more about, possible direction. What do you think about these? And, that's one way to get very specific feedback if you're trying to think about a product launch or an existing product. So I think it just depends on what you're looking for, but those are two ideas.
Yeah, I like those ideas a lot. I mean, it is sensitive. So I think that those are really thoughtful approaches that you've offered that can kind of get the info you need without overstepping a line or feeling like it's kind of an inquisition to your prospect, right?
Absolutely.
Uh, Okay, this is a question that is specific to healthcare and I mean other industries where compliance has a high priority and is at the forefront. Do you find that there are challenges, compliance and privacy challenges with data protection and regulations that make it difficult for you to get really meaningful insights for your segmentation? Or are there, like, how do you navigate that? While obviously you have a huge priority and you can tell how much you care about your customers in just how you talk about your role. How do you navigate data protection when also looking for insights when it's about something like mental health or physical health?
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, data privacy and compliance, especially in the healthcare space, is number one top priority. You never want to be at a company, especially in a marketing position, where there's any issues or challenges that arise in that space, whether or not they're public. So that's something, I think that I've always focused as a strength. And the organizations that I work at, and I always advocate for us to be almost more conservative in some ways. And so that does have its pros and cons. I think in terms of, we might proactively choose not to use certain data, even if it is, legally, technically allowed, because we just don't think it's the right thing to do. That does mean that it might be harder to segment and, target certain individuals that could really need or use some of the services that we're providing. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to us being really great about our value props and understanding what's going to resonate with the people that may need some of the services that we're providing. And so, I haven't found it to be a huge issue. It just means that we have to be really strong in some of these other areas.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I am sad to say that we are coming to the top of the hour. So I have one last question that I am going to leave us all with. For you, if there is someone who is new to approaching go-to-market strategy, who's taking it on for the first time, or maybe they've been doing it a long time, but they want to go back to the basics and they want to kind of revisit their roots and the core foundation, do you have kind of one big piece of advice or a guiding insight for them to hang on to? I will give you one moment to think about that because I'm going to tell all of these folks that asked amazing questions here. I am so sorry we did not get to answer all of these because I'm reading them and I want to know the answer to them too. I think they're fantastic. If you are a member of our community, go ask these questions in Pragmatics alumni community. Arianna is there. She's an alum as well. And there are so many folks in the community that have insights on these topics. And I guarantee you'll get some really generous feedback and insights from the folks in there. There's over 50,000 members who are all alum like you. So go ask them from there. Callie will drop the link for you, and we can continue the conversation that way. But to bring us home, Arianna, what is that one kind of big guiding light or foundational insight that you would offer folks?
Yeah, well, I thought of one, and then when you were speaking, I thought, it prompted another thought. So I would just say that one, if you are new or you've been doing this for a long time and you're looking to improve, where I've always found so much value in terms of learning and is really from the communities in the product marketing space, whether it's Pragmatic, there's lots of others online that I've participated in as well. And just getting those real world insights around what other people have tried and reaching out and connecting with folks. I've connected with so many folks, through those communities, LinkedIn, and just asking for a few minutes to run something by them. Get someone outside of your company, get their perspective, because they might have a really interesting approach or something that they've tried or just an idea for you to think about. So I would say, don't limit yourself to resources within your organization. But the other thought that I had was, we haven't really talked much about stakeholder management. I could talk all about tactics and strategy and, you need to get positioning right or that right. But at the end of the day, a really successful, I think a successful go-to-market launch is not only successfully externally, but it's successfully internally as well. You need to think about product marketing as an internal job, and how are you marketing and positioning both yourself and your team and what you're doing internally and getting that alignment. So I'd just say, don't forget about the internal folks when you're thinking about product marketing and how you're positioning as well.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really smart. And I think a lot of people do. I think that we forget about it. But kind of imagining yourself as an internal consultant almost, or an internal product marketer, is very, very shrewd. Okay, that is the end of our time. Thank you everyone so much for joining us for this chat. I have really enjoyed the time. I hope that you all have as well. So many thanks to you, Arianna. Thank you for sharing our knowledge and really exemplifying the generosity of the community of product marketers out there, and how folks are willing to share their knowledge with everyone else. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, guys, until next time.